I'm going to concentrate today on net zero as another catastrophic industrial policy. It's already more catastrophic than Japan's policies in the 1980s, and it's potentially as catastrophic as Italian fascism in the 1920s and 30s. Now we know, I'm not going to talk about food security. Paul Dreesen is an expert on that. But energy and food security are very closely connected. And that's because modern agriculture requires one hell of a lot of energy. Production, transportation, refrigeration, and also that miraculous Haber-Bosch process that turns natural gas into ammonia, which is the basis for nitrogen-based fertilizers, which modern agriculture couldn't do without. So it requires a lot of energy, and most of it's fossil fuels. Most of the increase in energy consumption demand is coming from the developing countries. And by the way, China is still a developing country, and whether you think that's real or not, the Paris Climate Treaty still classifies China as a developing country, even though Chinese energy use now dwarfs that of the United States, Europe, Canada, Australia, and Japan. That's why Chinese emissions are higher than all those other countries combined. China uses half the world's coal. So most of the increasing demand is in the developing countries, India and some of the Asian countries particularly. But it's going up here apparently because of the demand for more and more power for the data centers required for the internet and AI. And there are indications that this is actually true. Google promised in 2020 to go have only non-emitting power by 2030, and yet they admitted a few weeks ago that their emissions are 50% higher now than they were 5 years ago. So that's a rough sketch of the background to the situation that confronts the net zero agenda and the energy rationing policies that it requires. I'm going to digress. Let me stipulate that I personally do not believe that climate change is an existential crisis. I think the rate of warming is far below that of what has been predicted by the computer models. I think the impacts are mostly mild. Most of them are beneficial so far. And the computer models have been proven wrong and wrong again and again. But leave that aside. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter in the least whether there's a climate crisis or not. The fact is that the climate policies being pursued are much more expensive and much more damaging than the alleged problem. Maybe by a factor of 10, maybe by a factor of 100. All of the benefits of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, if you look at the scenarios used by the United Nations, are found after 2100, up to 2300. And yet all of the costs of reducing emissions have to be paid for by this generation and the next generation. So economics is about putting off the costs and enjoying the benefits as long as possible, right? We're doing the opposite of that. Net zero is the opposite of that. Now, how far have we gotten so far on reducing greenhouse gas emissions since the Rio Treaty was signed in 1992. Jeff Curry at Goldman Sachs a couple of years ago estimated that in the previous 10 years, the world had spent $3.8 trillion on renewable energy. And the percentage of energy coming from fossil fuels, that emit carbon dioxide when they're burned, had gone down from 82% to 81%. But Jeff Curry did not add that in that 10-year period, global demand for energy went up 30%. Right? So we went down as a total of fossil fuels, 82 to 81%. Those are the facts that cannot be denied. Now let's consider what has been done to implement net zero so far, and I'm going to concentrate on the United States. It's worse in Europe, but I get depressed when I think about Europe. So, some of the policies are industrial policies from times past, but they've been adapted to this new world of net zero emissions. I could go back a long ways, but I'll start with the Energy Policy and Conservation Act of 1975, which was designed, which came about after the Arab oil embargo and with the disastrous Nixon price controls on oil. That included corporate average fuel economy standards for vehicles, mileage standards, and efficiency standards for every kind of appliance, including air conditioners and furnaces, washing machines, and stoves. Next, we get the Supreme Court decision in 2007, Massachusetts versus EPA, that said that the EPA could use the Clean Air Act to regulate CO2 emissions from vehicles. So in 2007, we also got the Clean Power Plan to regulate the coal-fired power plants out of existence and new vehicle emission standards, and those were tied to something called the California Waiver, which I don't have time to go into. In 2015, we got the Paris Climate Treaty. Of course, we had a 4-year respite when President Trump took us out. And then we got the Biden pledges under Paris, and now all the rejiggered Obama regulations for power plants and for vehicles. So what have been the results of where we've gone so far? But before I forget, I want to mention that one of the arguments of all of the proponents of an energy rationing regime have said repeatedly that the first emissions cuts, the first closures of fossil fuel plants, those will be the cheapest. As it goes along, it will get more expensive. So we've gone a little bit of the way. We haven't reduced emissions yet, but we have spent trillions of dollars. So what have we gotten for those trillions of dollars? Greenhouse gas emissions have decreased in the United States and Europe. In the United States, they've decreased primarily because of the shale revolution, which allowed electric utilities to replace old coal-fired power plants with new gas turbines. In Europe, the major cause of emissions decline has been deindustrialization. And we've had that here too. California is totally deindustrialized. Energy prices have gone up. I think you're all aware of that if you ever look at your utility bill. But if you live in California or Germany or Britain or a couple of other places, they've gone up, they skyrocketed. At the same time, grid reliability has gone down. And I have a long series of quotes I could give you, but the grid operators and the regulators have come up with, in recent years, have warned repeatedly that conventional dispatchable power plants are being closed down too quickly, and that and too quickly is really putting it very charitably, to keep the grid going. We are going to face more and more blackouts. Now, ground zero for that is Texas. Texas, starting with Governor George W. Bush in 1999, advised by Ken Lay of Enron, his family's chief political fundraiser. You remember Enron, some of you. They passed a wind mandate to take advantage of the federal subsidy, and Ken Lay thought he could get rich. Well, what's happened? Texas has more wind, and it now has more solar than any other state. And the grid is in constant peril whenever it gets hot. And as we found out in 2021, it's also in peril when it gets really cold. Luckily, it doesn't happen very often. So grid reliability is under threat here. Even in the Midwest, it's under threat. And then there's emissions whack-a-mole. That's another product of these policies. As emissions have plateaued or gone down in some countries like the United States and Britain and Germany, they've gone up tremendously, as I said, in China. Well, why is that? Because California, for example, has outsourced all of its energy-intensive goods to places that actually have affordable power and can make these goods. That's why all the wind turbines and wind blades and solar panels are manufactured in China. They have coal-fired power plants. It's cheap there. So emissions whack-a-mole is what's really happening. So I'm going to conclude very soon now. I want to say two things and then give a summary of what I think needs to be done. First of all, it would actually be better to take all the cash, the taxpayer cash going to wind and solar subsidies, we'll leave aside some of the others, wind and solar subsidies, and bury the cash in the ground. And the reason is because subsidies are meant to reduce the price of a product to the consumer. So tortillas are subsidized in some Latin American countries so that poor people can afford something to eat. But the end product of wind and solar subsidies is that they lower the price of wind and solar production, which then raises the price of electricity every time a wind and solar plantation is put online. So the end result is to raise the price for consumers. Therefore, it would be better to bury the cash in the ground, because the subsidies are not useless, they're damaging. And like all industrial policies, the indirect consequence of the net zero agenda is almost entirely negative. It's created a gigantic climate industrial complex, a client class of special interests that demand to be fed with more and more handouts. It's a group of hucksters, charlatans, con men, and some sincere believers sprinkled in. They are all united by wanting, whether they believe it or not, whether they believe what they say or not, to get rich by doing good. In short, it's a racket. It's a gigantic climate racket. And net zero also requires a massive bureaucracy to regulate and distribute the goodies. This has been recognized by a lot of people, but I want to quote something from Calvin Coolidge. In a speech he gave, President Calvin Coolidge, in a speech he gave on 15th of May, 1926. This is at a time when he was already seeing what was happening as the result of Woodrow Wilson's creation of the administrative state, and he was also seeing how similar it was to what was going on with Italian fascism. No plan of centralization has ever been adopted which did not result in bureaucracy, tyranny, inflexibility, reaction, and decline. Of all forms of government, those administered by bureaus are about the least satisfactory to an enlightened and progressive people. Being irresponsible, they become autocratic. And being autocratic, they resist all development. Unless bureaucracy is constantly resisted, it breaks down representative government and overwhelms democracy. It is the one element in our institutions that sets up the pretense of having authority over everybody and being responsible to nobody. That's so much better than what I've said. I should have just read the whole speech. Let me conclude by considering the question, what is to be done? Okay, first, President Trump needs to, for the second time, withdraw the United States from the Paris Climate Treaty. And this time, he should do it in the right way, which we can talk about. Second, President Trump should, for the second time, repeal all the energy rationing regulations that are destroying the grid and the auto industry. Third, the Republican 19th Congress should use budget reconciliation legislation to repeal all the energy subsidies in the so-called Inflation Reduction Act of 2022. Until that is done, the climate industrial complex will be fully funded to wreck our grid and auto industry and to use the cash to lobby for more money. Fourth, if for some reason President Trump and the Republican Congress are not in our future, I would urge all of you to consider building a wood-fired or biomass-fired backup generator. Now, these are not in commercial production, but if you go to the website of Mother Earth News, they give you instructions about building your own. Thank you very much.